Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our September 16th class, Budgeting and Special Assessments, Common Mistakes. My name is Alina Gilbert. I'll be presenting today. And you know what? I'm looking at the date, September 16th. We're halfway done with September. Where did the year go? Oh my gosh. Just as an FYI, we do have our 2027 webinars up on our website under education. So if you're curious or interested in what we're going to be offering next year, it is up. You can go ahead and register for whatever sounds good to you. We have some pretty cool topics coming up next year. But let us worry about this year for now, and I will give you a little bit of comic relief as I go through the housekeeping items. The bulk of your screen should be the PowerPoint, so the little bubble head people, whatever they are. And to the left of the screen is me. Hello. Hopefully that's a small picture of me. On the right side of the screen, you should also be seeing, oh, hi, I misspoke. Someone just called me on it. Not the 2027 classes, the 2026 classes. See, in my brain, it's already 2026. Thank you for catching that. Yes, the 2026 classes are up on the website, not the 27. I'm not that quick. Okay, sorry, moving on. So on the right side of the screen, you should see a little chat icon, and that's where you would go to type in your questions. I am going to save the questions for the end because a lot of times, you know, someone will have a question, and as we go through the webinar, it gets answered. So it's just easier, and because I want to make sure we have time to get through all the materials before we get to the questions. If you are having any audio or video issues as you're watching this, there should be a little icon at the bottom that says audio or video issues ? Go ahead and click on that. It's going to take you through a series of steps and hopefully resolve the issue. If you type me a message, there's really nothing I can do on my end here. So hopefully that little button can resolve the issue for you. We are going to be issuing one CMCA credit for this class. For those of you community managers who are attending, it's going to be automatically generated and emailed to you. You should have it by tomorrow, I would think. Now, keep in mind, ever since, I don't know when this started, last year, a few months ago, I don't know, but when you get the email with your credit on there, make sure you save the credit, the picture, either print it out or save the actual picture of it, because for some reason they disappear after about 30 days. And we haven't been able to figure out how to stop that. So please just save that so you aren't looking for it 30 days later and it's gone. As a reminder, we are recording today's presentation. It will be uploaded to our YouTube channel the next couple of days. So if you want to watch it again because it's so exciting, or if you have someone who you want to recommend it to, it is available. We just can't issue credits for the recordings. And finally, last but not least, you will see a little survey pop up at the end. If you have time and the inclination, we certainly appreciate whatever feedback you have. As far as I'm concerned, there's no such thing as bad feedback. It's all feedback. It's all good. It all helps us improve. So please, please, if you have time, we do appreciate any comments to help us improve for next time. Okay, so without further ado, yes, I have inappropriate memes, sort of inappropriate memes, but you know, power for the cause. Let's talk about the reason we are doing this webinar is because there's still a lot of confusion, as you might imagine, with respect to the budgeting process. It's kind of convoluted, it's kind of confusing, and it's kind of, people aren't really sure what it is. And so we're going to try and simplify this as much as we can to hopefully give you guys some tools when you do have questions from board members or homeowners or something, so you can respond to the questions or at least know if you need to reach out to the attorney. So I like to start at the very beginning. So in the beginning, we had two divisions when it comes to budgeting. We had the pre-CCIOA communities and the post-CCIOA communities. The pre-CCIOA communities, so those communities created before July 1, 1992, they weren't subject to any kind of statutory regulation with respect to budgeting. And so basically whatever they had in their covenants went. Okay? So if they had, especially with older communities, like really older communities, we typically see provisions where the board has carte blanche to impose whatever assessments they want, impose whatever special assessments they want. They don't have to go through the homeowners, they just impose it. And that was okay back then because that's what the governing document said. And then we also had then our post-CCIOA communities, and those were subject to the statutory budget ratification process that we see in CCIOA. But now, where are we now? About, I can't remember exactly, I want to say 6 to 8 years ago, maybe even a little bit more, CCIOA was updated and the statutory budget provision was made applicable to all associations regardless of when they were created. So at this point, if you're managing a community or you're sitting on the board of a community where you've got language that says the board can do whatever the heck it wants, stop for a minute because it's not going to work that way anymore. So everyone now is subject to the CCIOA budget process, but pre-CCIOA communities have a little bit of a different requirement when it comes to certain things. So let's talk about the budget process in general. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the pre-CCIOA communities and what it means for you. But everything I'm talking about right now, this whole section, applies to all communities. Okay? So, first step, simple, easy peasy, right? Board adopts the budget. Now, granted, it's not as easy as it sounds, but we all know what it means to create a budget and for the board to say, yes, this is the budget we want to utilize ideally for next fiscal year. So that's the first step for all communities. Board has to adopt the budget. Then the board has to deliver the budget or a summary of the budget to all unit owners. When do we have to deliver it? Within 90 days of when the board adopts it. So basically, the board adopts the budget in a meeting. We should have meeting minutes that show when the board approved it formally. And that starts our 90-day clock. So within that 90-day period, immediately after, we've got to send either a copy of the whole budget or I don't know what a summary of the budget really would entail. Generally, when I review these board packets, I see the full budget attached, but CCIOA says a summary is also acceptable. But again, don't ask me what that means. So you're sending it out. How do we send it out? Well, CCIOA says you can send it out by first-class mail, so snail mail, or you can deliver it in some other method, including posting it on the website, which is totally acceptable. So some of you are probably thinking right now, hold on, Alina, why are we then mailing out the budget all the time if we can just post it on the website and be done with it? That is a very good question, which will be answered in this slide, which is the board sets a date for the meeting to consider the budget, for the homeowners to consider the budget. What does that mean? So that means now, regardless of when you send out the actual budget or the summary of the budget to folks, you also now have to set a meeting with your homeowners for them to consider the budget. When do we have to do that? Well, it's within a reasonable amount of time after the summary is delivered. But nobody usually does that. Usually what I see is you're sending out the budget ratification meeting notice along with the budget. You're sending them at the same time. And so a lot of times the budget is included in that same envelope when you're mailing the meeting notice. Now, meeting notices for homeowner meetings, which a budget ratification meeting is, it is a meeting of your homeowners. Those under Kiowa have to absolutely positively go by snail mail as one of the methods. Now, can we do anything other than snail mail? Well, the only other option is we can hand deliver. I suspect most of you do not want to hand deliver meeting notices to the homeowners. So the answer is it's going by snail mail. Now, as you might remember, you also have to physically post meeting notices of the homeowner meetings. You have to email it if the homeowners request an email. It's also encouraged under Kiowa to email. But ultimately, if you don't snail mail it or hand deliver it, it's not going to be a valid meeting notice. So we're always going to be snail mailing something. So the other caveat here is the notice has to be sent in accordance with the bylaws, which means the timing that is specified in the bylaws. This is a little different than what we typically preach. What we typically tell you is, hey, Kiowa says homeowner meetings, you got to give notice 10 to 50 days, regardless of anything that your documents might say, right? Because that's what Kiowa says. It doesn't really care. It doesn't say unless your documents provide otherwise. However, in this case, we do have a caveat that says, no, you're going to deliver notice as set forth in your bylaws. So if you have a set of bylaws that say the meeting notice must be sent 14 to 60 days, 15 to 40 days, 30 to 45 days, whatever it is that your bylaws provide, this is the one time when you are going to have to follow that. Okay, so keep in mind, you may not be having to utilize the 10 to 50 days in this case. It's whatever the bylaws provide. All right, we've done everything. We've sent the budget. We have sent the notice. Meeting time. All right, so here's another exception to the budget ratification meeting that you don't get with any other meeting, and that is we do not have a quorum requirement. What is a quorum? Quorum is the minimum number of folks we need at the meeting to be able to conduct business. In a budget ratification meeting, if you have one person show up, it's good enough. We don't care. And to kind of piggyback on that, if a majority of all owners, not just a majority of those who show up, but a majority of all owners don't attend the meeting and veto the budget, it is automatically deemed ratified. Okay, so if you have 100 units in your association, we don't care how many people show up to the budget ratification meeting, but if you don't have at least 51 owners showing up, and it can be in person, it can be by proxy, but if you don't have at least 51 folks vetoing the budget, not just showing up, but showing up and vetoing the budget, it is automatically passed. Now, the majority of all is the minimum. Kiowa sets that as an absolute minimum of how many owners it takes to veto the budget. You can have a higher requirement in your declaration. I have seen 67%, I've seen 90%, I've seen 95% to veto the budget. But if your documents don't provide the veto requirement, then it's a majority of all. If your documents provide something that's less than a majority of all, it goes up to a majority of all. That is the bare minimum veto requirement. Okay. Now, if your budget is vetoed, which doesn't happen as often with a budget ratification process, but if it is vetoed, then basically the association has to continue to function off the budget that was last ratified, whenever that was, whether it was last year, the year before, whenever. Okay, so why does Kiowa create this process? What is kind of the impetus here? The impetus here is, well, you know how hard it is to get homeowners to approve things. And we also know that we don't want a board necessarily to have an unfettered right to do whatever it thinks is appropriate. And so you kind of want to combine both the board's ability to impose assessments in order to take care of the community with an opportunity for owners to be able to have some say in it, but without making it so difficult for the board to impose assessments that nothing ever gets done, right? So the impetus here is, look, we are going to let the board set the budget, and if it's that egregious, if it's that horrible, there shouldn't be an issue with at least the majority of owners showing up and saying no. That's the theory, is the burden is now on the homeowners to review it and to say no, as opposed to the board to sell it to the community and get the approval. So it's kind of flipping the model on its head here. And if you ask me, I think that's a much better way to move forward, because I'm sure you've all been in situations where you do have a homeowner approval requirement, and guess what? And you can't get it. And now I just had an email exchange with a community manager, and she wrote, so if we can't pass this budget, then we don't have enough money to make these necessary repairs. What do we do? And I was like, well, there's nothing really you can do. You need to make sure your homeowners are educated to know what will happen if they don't ratify this budget. But this is a issue we have over and over again. So that is the reason it is drafted the way it is. Now, I do want to make a note. It's very important. The CCIOA budget process has a very specific provision in it that says this ratification process does not negate if you have provisions in your declaration that actually require an affirmative vote of the homeowners. So sometimes we do see, and again, especially in older documents, provisions that say, so you still need homeowner approval if you're going to increase assessments by more than a certain amount. So that does not go away. That does not become a ratification process. If you have a homeowner approval requirement, you've got to follow the homeowner approval requirement. Which brings me to exceptions. And this is the pre-CCIOA exception. So up to this point, we really have kind of the same process for a pre-CCIOA community. Board still adopts the budget, board still sends out a summary or the budget within 90 days, board still calls meeting. Okay, those things are all the same. Now, if you have a declaration that right now provides carte blanche for your boards to do whatever they want with assessments, that goes away. They don't have carte blanche anymore. They need to hold the budget ratification process. They have a majority veto imposed, just like the pre-CCIOA communities do. So they still have to go through the process and get the budget ratified before they can impose those assessments. However, you might have a declaration that says you can increase assessments by 10% every year, but you can't exceed it. And if you exceed it, you need to get this many homeowners to approve. So what happens in this case? So for pre-CCIOA communities, you can go up to whatever the 10% increase without having to ratify. Now, very important, you still have to have a meeting with the homeowners to talk about the budget. Okay, so to answer questions, but there's no ratification here. This is something that the board can do if there is a cap on how much you can increase assessments. And then if you go over that number, you still have to get the approval that's in your documents. How does this compare to a post-CCIOA community? So if you have a post-CCIOA community that also says, hey, you can do whatever you want up to 10% every year, and then you got to get homeowner approval, well, in that case, a post-CCIOA community would still be required to get that ratified, the up to 10%. They would still have to go through the ratification process. A pre-CCIOA community would just have to call a meeting to talk about it. So that's the big difference here. And then if you get over the 10%, then both communities have to go through with the homeowner approval requirement. So again, so you can see as I'm talking about this, it is fairly convoluted, and you just really need to be careful, and we'll go into like where all the pitfalls are here in a little bit, but we need to be, again, careful with how we do this, and especially if you are like a pre-CCIOA community with a cap. So what about special assessments? We, especially this day and age, it seems like there's always special assessments getting imposed by communities because we're having the hail claims, there's fires, whatever it is, we need to impose that special assessment. Our, insurance deductibles are huge. We got to get that from somewhere. So what does that mean? Well, the first question is, what do your documents, regardless of the age of the community, what do your documents say about special assessments? If you have a provision in your documents, again, regardless of when the community was created, you have a provision that says association can impose special assessments to defray the costs of unexpected expenditures, blah, 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 but only with the approval of 67% of the homeowners. If that's the language you have, you're going to have to get approval of the homeowners. You're going to have to get that approval. You can't really get around that. If you have a provision that says the board can carte blanche impose special assessments without any kind of approval requirements, you will need to follow the ratification process. So how do we do that? Well, what you're going to do is take your current budget. You're going to add an extra income line to represent whatever that special assessment is. And then you're going to add an extra expenditure line to represent whatever that expense is going to be that we're going to use the special assessments for. The board then will, again, approve the budget like it had to originally. It will, within 90 days, send out the budget, and it will schedule a budget ratification meeting. All the same ratification requirements apply. So in other words, we don't need quorum. We need a majority of all owners to veto it for it to not pass. Or if you have a higher veto requirement, then that's what needs to happen for it to not to pass. A lot of documents we see have this weird language that says you need 67% of all owners to approve, or 67% of the owners who are voting, except that quorum is going to go up to like 60% of everybody. You guys have seen those provisions, right? And then if you can't get that quorum, then you have to hold a second meeting within like 30 days, and then the quorum goes down to 30%, one half. If you've got language like that in your documents, again, you're gonna have to follow that, because that also typically comes with the approval requirement. So whatever the approval requirements are, we do still have to follow them. We can't ignore them and say, oh, but it's all budget ratification now. No, if we have a more stringent requirement in the declaration, we're following. Okay, so if you are, it doesn't really matter if you're a pre-CCIOA or a post-CCIOA community when it comes to the special assessments. The first thing, like I said, the first thing you're going to do is look for a special assessment provision in your documents. And if it requires approval, you're following that. If it requires a higher quorum, you're following that. If you don't have any special assessment provisions in your governing documents, then you are following the CCIOA budget process by amending your current budget, like I said, to add an income and an expenditure line and going through the ratification process. If you have a provision that says special assessments will be imposed in accordance with the CCIOA budget process, again, you are going to follow that CCIOA budget process. Now, I know it gets very confusing with special assessments especially, so I'm trying to kind of break it down into categories. If you have questions, feel free to pop them up and we will go through those when I get done. I want to move on to, though, the classes called, our common mistakes. So I do want to talk about where we tend to go wrong. Okay, there's lots of common mistakes when it comes to the budget ratification meetings and processes that I want to cover, because if we don't follow the process as we need to, or we deviate, or we think we do, it has to be one way, but it's really a different way, the budget you just ratified is not going to be validly ratified. And A, you're going to be subject to challenge from homeowners. B, you're probably not going to be able to collect on it. And C, it could even be a liability exposure if we try to collect on it. So it's really important that this is done by the book. All right, so where do we go wrong? Well, the first one we just talked about, right? The declaration requires specific approval from owners to increase an assessment, to impose a special assessment, whatever it is. It requires owner approval, and we say, oh, well, we don't have to do that because we're going to do the ratification process. Don't get caught in that mistake. If you have approval requirements, follow those. Doesn't matter when you were created. Wrong timing for notice. So remember earlier I said you have to follow the notice requirement in your bylaws, not necessarily what Kiowa requires, 10 to 50 days. A lot of times you guys listen to the attorneys too well, and you're like, oh, I remember Alina said it was 10 to 50 days no matter what our documents say, which is true for every homeowner meeting except this one. So for this one, don't listen to the 10 to 50 day requirement. That doesn't apply in this case. It has to be what your bylaws dictate. So that is another common mistake we see with budget ratification notices and meetings. Another one we see is a higher veto requirement set forth in the declaration than what the board is requiring. So the board assumes it's a majority of all owners, and in reality, your declaration says something like 67%. You go, you have the meeting, you have 51% of the homeowners show up and veto the budget, except that that's not enough. But the board thinks it is because it's going off the majority number instead of the 67% set forth in the governing documents. So kind of the lesson here is make sure you look at your bylaws so you know exactly what those requirements are, and you're not A, misstating them in the meeting notice, and B, you're not assuming that you have a veto when you really don't. All right, here's another big one, not holding a meeting and doing some sort of an action outside of a meeting or using a mail ballot. So we always preach that this is something that associations can do because the statute says anything you can do in a meeting, you can do outside of a meeting by a mail ballot or action outside of a meeting. And so, again, you guys listen to us too well sometimes, and you're saying, oh yeah, I remember Alina saying we could do that. So let's just do like a mail ballot vote or an action outside of a meeting for this budget so we don't have to hold the meeting. Wrong. Statute says you gotta hold this meeting. You cannot get around the meeting. You cannot use a different method for your budget ratification. So don't think that just because we're doing something else by mail ballot, we can do this by mail ballot. You have to hold a meeting. Now, it does not necessarily have to be a physical meeting, okay? It can be a virtual meeting. Now, you're gonna need to obviously have your systems in place to be able to know who's there, to be able to take proxies and to have a valid count of how many folks are there. I generally say just hold the physical meeting. It is, you're less likely to get a majority of all your owners showing up to a physical meeting as opposed to a virtual one. It's easier to take attendance. It's easier to count the proxies. You'll know who's there. Okay, and so use that to your advantage and hold the physical meeting. But whatever you do, don't try to take action outside of a meeting when it comes to the budget ratification process. All right. Now, I know I can't see any of you, but if we were in a physical class, I'd be like, by show of hands, show me how many of you do your budget ratification during the annual meeting. And there'll be people putting up their hands. And I would say, be careful with that. The budget ratification meeting does not require quorum, but your annual meeting does. So there is a big difference between holding just a budget ratification meeting at which we don't care who shows up versus we are holding an annual meeting and one of the agenda items is to ratify the budget. That is very different legally. That is something that would still require a quorum because it's part of the annual meeting and you cannot conduct any business at an annual meeting if you don't have quorum. So what is the recommendation here? Well, if you want to hold the annual meeting and the budget ratification meeting on the same night, you can do it. But do it as two back-to-back meetings, which means what? Which means our budget, so our meeting notice. I don't care how many sheets of paper you use, but you need to be very clear that we are holding two meetings tonight. It's first, we're doing 6 p.m. to 6:15 p.m. budget ratification meeting, 6:15 p.m. to 8 p.m. annual meeting. This is incredibly important, and I know it feels like semantics, right? And it is semantics, but from a legal perspective, it's not. We want to make sure that you are separating your annual meeting from your budget ratification meeting, even if you want to hold them back to back. This is something that I unfortunately have been at several meetings, annual meetings, where there wasn't a quorum and the board said, well, you know, let's just go ahead and ratify the budget because we don't need a quorum. And I was the jerk who stood there and said, nope, you can't do it because it's an annual meeting. Needless to say, the boards were not happy with me, but this is kind of the way it is. And we need to make sure that if you are ever concerned about not having quorum at your annual meeting, don't combine these meetings. Don't make it an annual meeting with a line item to ratify the budget. It is could work against you, and then you'd have to call another meeting for your budget ratification so that you don't have to deal with a quorum issue. Okay. By the way, this isn't an icon on here, but sometimes I talk to boards and what they want to do, what they ask me is, if we ratify the budget in January, can we just make it retroactive to October so we can start imposing the higher assessments in October once the budget is ratified? No, you can't make it retroactive. Your budget ratification is for the upcoming fiscal year. You can't make it go backwards to assessments that have already been imposed and come due. Okay. So don't do that. Be careful with that. Also, a lot of your documents, a lot of declarations have language in their assessment provisions that say you have to give notice of at least 30 days to owners before you can impose an assessment. Be wary of those provisions as well. If you have that provision and you've passed your budget, you got to wait 30 days before you can give the assessment notice. So those are all like little provisions that hide in the governing documents that can backfire on you if you don't know that they exist. If you don't want to read the declaration forward and backwards, I don't blame you. This is why you have nerdy attorneys like me who are more than happy to do that for you. So at least reach out to the association's legal counsel if you're not sure, or you want to make sure there's no weird sort of requirements in your governing documents. I get a lot of emails and calls from associations about what do we need to do to impose the special assessment. And I always make sure to read through those provisions, because when I respond, I want to be able to tell them, hey, you also have this 30-day notice requirement, and you have this other requirement. So please, please read the governing documents and make sure you know what all these requirements are for your specific community. Okay. Wow. Okay, following outdated declarations. So we kind of touched upon this, the older declarations tell us, a lot of times we'll say the board can impose any assessment, anytime, and any amount, right? And it can require homeowners to pay that without the homeowners having any ability to approve it, to make comments to it, anything. So if you don't know about the Kiowa budget process and you just follow your old documents that were created long before Kiowa was created, you're going to think you're doing the right thing because you're following your documents, when in reality, it is contrary to what the law requires. So that is a common mistake. Be careful, community managers who are on this webinar, be careful, make sure you keep track of those old documents and know that some of those budget processes that are in there are not going to follow Kiowa, and they don't apply to your communities anymore. Insurance deductible assessments. Okay, so these are a really, really big deal. I want to spend a little bit of time on this. I mean, insurance in and of itself, most people don't enjoy talking about it. They don't really understand it. But I just want to focus on the deductibles. So when you have your wind hail claim and you've got, your deductible is 10% of the value of the policy, value. And our policy value is 10 million, right? So 10% would be $1 million. So $1 million is our deductible. We have wind hail claim, and we're essentially self-insuring. But anyway, we got to come up with $1 million. And this is where a lot of folks get confused. They're like, okay, wait, so is this a special assessment? Is this like an assessment for deductibles? Is this an insurance assessment? What is this? Well, the first thing to realize is we won't know without looking at your documents, because sometimes the documents carve out insurance assessments, deductible assessments, and sometimes they don't. And if they don't carve that out, then we need to go look at your special assessment provision to make sure that a special assessment to pay for this huge deductible is an appropriate assessment to impose. In other words, sometimes if you look at your special assessment language, it'll be very limiting, and it'll say you can only impose this to make repairs to common elements, for example. Well, we're in a townhome community and we need to replace the roof, but the roofs are not common elements. These are townhomes and they belong to the homeowners, but the association is responsible for insuring them. So what do you do when you need $1 million to pay for roof replacement, but your special assessment provision only allows you to impose for common element repairs, which this isn't? And I can guarantee you the developer's attorney who drafted that had no clue that, of all the implications with drafting it in the way that they drafted it. So what do? Great question. I think you amend. I think you have to amend, because right now, if that's all you got, you don't have a real good mechanism to pay for that. And we need to pay for that. So, but that's kind of off on a tangent. Sometimes you will see language in your declaration that says, if you don't have enough money coming in from insurance, that the association can impose an assessment, and they call it different things. Sometimes it's called an insurance assessment. Sometimes it's called a supplemental assessment. Sometimes it's called something completely different. You can impose this assessment, against owners for this, to pay for this. And sometimes it uses the word deductible, sometimes it doesn't. But if we know it's an insurance-related assessment, typically we can assume that that would include the deductible because that's really where we lose the money. So if you have a provision like that, be careful with it, because sometimes I see it says you can impose this assessment period, end of story. Well, if you're imposing this assessment and you're just imposing it, there's a really, really good argument that you still have to go through the ratification process because it is a special assessment of sorts. It's just for a very specific purpose. So don't just impose it, because associations have gotten in trouble for less than that. You want to go through the ratification process. Sometimes I'll even see provisions that say, if you're imposing a special, or not especially, if you're imposing this kind of an assessment, this will not constitute a regular assessment for which you have to go through the budget ratification process. This is something that the board can impose to cover, the loss. And if I see that language, I feel a lot better about saying, okay, maybe you don't go through the budget ratification process. But I also think it's important to know that there is a risk associated with that, because again, just because we say it's not an assessment that follows the Kiowa budget process and the declaration doesn't mean a judge would agree with us. And it doesn't mean that if someone questions that, because we didn't go through any kind of a budget ratification process, that doesn't mean that we are going to win in that kind of a situation. So I always caution folks that, regardless of what your declaration may say with respect to these insurance deductible assessments, the safest option is to go through the ratification process. However, if your documents are very explicit and say you don't have to follow the Kiowa budget process for this, and you can impose it, that is a little bit better of a situation than if they're completely quiet. But because the statute, if you can believe this, isn't completely clear on this issue, there is going to be a risk if we just impose this kind of a deductible assessment. Again, a lot of it is also very dependent on how your documents read and what they say. So I would always recommend that before you do anything with respect to this type of an assessment, that you check with legal counsel for your community, because we just don't know what your documents say. And sometimes there's just weird language that adds, other criteria into the mix, and we want to be careful. And of course, I know a lot of you are sitting there thinking, well, what about, the loss assessment for homeowners? And that is somewhat, irrelevant here, because a loss assessment is a type of insurance coverage that homeowners get to help them pay for assessments that are intended to be used to pay for repairs due to a loss. And we don't always, some of those carriers, they don't want to see the word deductible in there, and they'll deny the claim if they see deductible. Some of them want to see deductible, and the end result is there's really no one size fits all when it comes to these loss assessments that the individual homeowners then put in a claim for with their individual carriers. That doesn't really apply to the association. And I probably just confused everybody. All right, and now in special assessments. Last but not least, we've talked about the special assessments. Very similar to the insurance deductible assessments. But remember, you're going to follow your declaration if there's an approval requirement. If you can just impose them, you will need to go through some sort of a budget ratification. Well, not some sort, but the budget ratification process. Okay. Now I'm done about 15 minutes before the end, which is good because now I'm going to go through your questions and we can get those answered. But first, comic relief. Okay. I am now, oh, there's a lot of questions, so I'm going to try and get through all of these. Can we send a budget out via email if we are small enough? We don't and we don't have a website. So if you're just sending out just the budget, not the meeting notice, yes, you can send the budget via email, but your meeting notice will still have to be sent either by snail mail, or if you're real small, 4 units, and you want to knock on doors and hand it to people, you can do that as well. Do non-Kiowa communities need to snail mail meeting notices? So depending on what you mean by non-Kiowa. So if you're created before Kiowa, you're still subject to this. If you are a community that's exempt from Kiowa because you're a limited expense community or a large planned community, there's very specific requirements to be exempt, then you're not subject to Kiowa, and no, you are not required to even follow the budget ratification process because you're not subject to the statute. If a specific owner asks for a proxy for the budget ratification meeting, do we have to send one and use it if returned? So you're never required to provide proxy forms to your homeowners. Despite popular belief, it's not a requirement. We don't have to send them out with the meeting notices. If a homeowner asks you for a proxy form, you can say, we don't have a proxy form. You use your own proxy. And then basically what you're doing is you're putting it in the homeowner's hands to create their own proxy to bring to the meeting. So proxies don't really have a lot of requirements. Doesn't matter. They can draft it on a napkin as long as it's dated and has a signature on it. That's all we're going to be looking for. So just keep in mind that almost anything is going to go as a proxy. And if you prefer for it to be like cleaner and in a format that the board prefers, then you could respond and say, yes, here's a proxy form that we would recommend you use, because that just might make your life a little bit easier, but you're not required to. Are there specific budget requirements for non-Kiowa communities outside of what might be in their documents? Again, if you're not subject to Kiowa, if you're exempt, then no, you are not subject to any of those requirements, whatever is in the governing documents. All right. Okay, can you reiterate? If a board has carte blanche to levy special assessments, they still need to follow the budget approval process. So in essence, the board doesn't have carte blanche. Yeah, that is absolutely correct. The board never is going to have the carte blanche anymore, other than a pre-Kiowa community that has an assessment cap, and a board is increasing assessments up to the cap. All right, then you don't have to get any approval or ratification in that case. Otherwise, you will need to ratify. Okay, we are planning a landscape renovation project. Some homeowners have made substantial financial contributions to the project prior to the special assessment, and their contributions will reduce the amount of the special assessment. Ooh. Can the board reduce those homeowners' special assessment by the amount of their contribution? Well, it would really depend on their governing documents. In most cases, I can guarantee you the answer is going to be no, and here's why. When you look at the assessment provisions, it'll tell you the allocation. So, for example, everybody has to pay assessments equally, right? And in the special assessment provision, it'll also say the special assessments will be allocated in the same way as your regular assessments, or they will be allocated equally, or they will be allocated in accordance with Exhibit B that has the allocated interests in there. So what that means is you have to follow that for the special assessment, and you can't change it just because someone donated money. So ultimately, we don't usually want to see homeowners just giving money out of their free will. We can't really reduce assessments because of that. So I think you need to be very careful. In this particular case, I would recommend you check with the association's legal counsel, because you may not be able to do what the board wants to do in this case. Okay, so if the meeting, and the virtual, or not the meeting, if the, is this the budget ratification meeting is held via Zoom, is a mail ballot required? Absolutely not. If you're doing a meeting, there are no mail ballots. There's only proxies. By the same token, if you're using mail ballot, or if you're having a meeting, there's no mail ballots. There's only proxies. They're mutually exclusive, so absolutely not. Oh, sorry, I take it back. No, I don't take it back, but let me clarify, because I realize this might not be clear. So if you're holding an electronic meeting, a Zoom meeting, you're still not using mail ballots, because that's a separate process. Okay, so no, you're not using mail ballots, but you need to allow people to vote. So there are platforms out there, such as, I think it's called like Election Buddy, or there's a whole bunch of platforms that allow homeowners to vote electronically when they're attending the meeting, and it complies with the requirements of Colorado law. So it wouldn't be a mail ballot, it would be a form of an electronic ballot that is used, but you need to have the appropriate platform for that. So sorry if I confused you on that one. All right. Can the budget ratification meeting be combined with the annual meeting? So we talked about that, and yes, it can, but then you got to be sure you're going to get the quorum. But if you have more questions, if I did not answer those questions in the presentation, please send another chat here. Can the board pass a budget by an action outside of a meeting? No, and I suspect that question was made before we got to that point. For an association that has an assessment increase cap, can they mail or present 2 board-approved budgets in the case of the one budget over the cap is vetoed by the homeowners? You know, I've had this question before. And in Kiowa, there really is no provision saying we can present 2 different budgets. What you would want to do if you have a cap and you are, well, if you want to go over the cap, you are going to need to do whatever the declaration says. Because a lot of times if you're going over the cap, it's not ratification, it's approval. So if you're under the cap and you're a pre-Kiowa community, then there is no ratification. As I said, it's just the meeting to discuss the budget. So in most cases, I really can't think of a situation where it'd be okay to have 2 budgets to be presented, but I think there might be some specific cases or specific things going on in this particular association that I don't know about that might change that opinion. So I would very much recommend you talk to the attorney about that one. The attorney meaning the attorney for that community. For the budget ratification meeting, are you required to accept proxies? Yes. Yes, you are. You have to accept proxies for any member meeting if they bring them. For a special assessment, our documents require a 2/3 owner's vote to approve the special assessment. Do you still need to hold the budget ratification meeting after the owner's vote to approve? No, no, it's one or the other. So if you have an owner approval requirement, you don't hold the budget ratification meeting, and you can actually do the vote by a mail ballot because you're not voting to ratify the budget, you're voting to approve the special assessment. So that is a key difference there. Can the HOA decide their own fiscal year if the bylaws state otherwise? For example, they use a January calendar year as their fiscal year, but their bylaws show fiscal years November through October. Technically, they are in violation of their documents. A homeowner could bring legal action and the association would lose. My recommendation in those cases is to update your bylaws to have the current fiscal year, or to just say the board can set the fiscal year. This is something that most of the time can be done without homeowner approval. Bylaws can typically be amended by the board, not for certain things, but for things like the fiscal year, we can have the bylaws amended with just a board approval vote. So that's something that can easily be ratified. Does the HOA have separate budget meeting minutes and annual meeting minutes for approval? Technically, yes. Of course, sometimes if you don't have a quorum, that ultimately all we're doing is I would call it like a meeting note, budget ratification meeting. This many people showed up. We had this many vetoes. Budget was ratified. So if you don't have a quorum, I would do it in the form of notes. If you do have a quorum at the budget ratification meeting, then yes, you would do it in the form of meeting minutes. And then yes, you would have them approved at the next at the next budget ratification meeting. Good question. A few more before we get to 1 o'clock. What do you do with board members that don't want an assessment increase but have severely underfunded reserves? Oh, wow. That's probably more than an hour discussion. I think the short answer is I would get their attorney in there to scare them, because what they're doing is they're probably breaching their fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of the community. Because saying we don't want to increase assessments when the community needs certain maintenance is not acting in the best interests of the association. So they could be exposing themselves to liability, and maybe they need their legal counsel for the association to come and explain that to them. I find that works quite often. Is there an example agenda, an altitude law regarding combined annual budget ratification meeting agenda? I do not believe we have that. You're welcome to look, but I don't think we have any sample agendas on there. In proposing a special assessment, does it need to be for something specific, such as the new roof, parking lot, etc.? And if the project comes under budget, what is that coverage? Okay, another question that we could talk about probably for a good hour. In general, if homeowners need to know what they're approving, why they're approving a special assessment. So they need to know what that money is going for. Even if you're ratifying the budget, you still need to show what that money is going for. So you can't just say, we're going to do a $10,000 special assessment just in case. You also need to look at specifics of your governing documents and the purposes that are allowed for the special assessment. Under the special assessment provisions, there's typically a list, and it says you can impose a special assessment for these different reasons. And if it's not listed in there, then arguably you cannot impose a special assessment for this. So I think in most cases, you are not likely going to be able to just impose a special assessment for nothing specific. You're probably going to need to explain what it's for. And you also probably, if you don't have the specific number and you think there's a chance we're imposing too much, you can specifically say when homeowners vote, if they have to vote, that any overages will go to the association's, to our, what do you call it? Not the operating fund, the reserve account. Thank you. Or they will be refunded. But I wouldn't go with a refund, because what's going to happen is you're going to have homeowners move in the meantime. So now you got to try and find them. And that's going to be a pain in your booty to try and find someone to give them a refund. And then what happens if you can't find them? I think it creates more problems than it solves to do it that way. Why can't the board pass the budget outside of a meeting? The board can pass a budget outside of a meeting. I'm saying the budget ratification with the homeowners has to be at a meeting. So no, the board can still do that. All right, we are at 1 o'clock. I appreciate all your time. Thank you. Please take the survey if you have time, and we will see you at the next webinar. Thanks, everyone.